Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. We'll be talking about the economic situation in the light of course, the IMF agreement. What are the key highlights? What can we expect overall as far as the economy is concerned after this agreement has now come through? Of course, we'll also be talking about the targets, mainly fiscal consolidation to reduce deficits, monetary policies which are aimed at controlling inflation, and energy sector reforms to address inefficiencies. For a while, we've been talking about energy sector reforms, we've been talking about policies which are, to aim at reducing inflation. We'll be talking about where we are with regard to these targets and what kind of measures do we expect to further address these goals as far as pursuant to this agreement and taking things forward is concerned. All of that today on Perspective. I have with me Dr. Usman Chohan, who is advisor on economy, CAS. Thank you so much for being with us today. We also have with us Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, who is former ambassador to WTO. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Manzoor, like I said, these are broad targets, these are broad goals, we can say, in terms of economy. First of all, I want to say this, and I think you will agree, we are in a much better position today than we were a year ago, even a few months ago. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I agree with that. I think there's no dispute about this particular thing, because if you look at any international organization, almost everyone agrees with that, that a year ago, we were talking about default, we were talking about very high inflation, reserves were low, everything was really, there was not a ray of light or hope. But I think those things have stabilized now.
So when we talk about stability and overall, let me include Dr. Usman in this also. Dr. Usman, when we talk about stability, earlier on, like Dr. Manzoor said, things were being said like, the dollar might hit, upwards of 500. A lot of things, there was this general air of uncertainty in the air, so to speak. You think that we've been able to quell that uncertainty sufficiently, and now we are stable enough, and we're on the path of, we know where we want to go at least.
Certainly, if you frame it in those terms, we're certainly doing a good job, which is to say that we have earned that stability. We have, as you said, realized where we need to go and made the commitment for that. The question is really not so much because of our lack of stability, but also the world has been serially unstable for the last 6 years. You had COVID, you had this inflation crisis, now you're going to have tariffs. Where in that did we do something wrong? Really nothing. And so the world is waiting with bated breath in this new episode of turbulence. 2025 may not necessarily be a good year for the global economy, and we were in no ways responsible for that.
So when we talk about, earlier uncertainty and we talk about now, Dr. Manzoor, turbulent period associated with Donald Trump, when we talk about tariffs and all of those things, are we going to be expecting more of, that global uncertainty to seep into our, national scene also?
Well, obviously it will have some impact. But one thing I have slight difference with Dr. Chohan is that yes, there were this big problem about COVID, etc. Yes, one additional thing we had was those floods, which was big. But otherwise, if you look at our neighbors like India, Bangladesh, they were doing much better. I mean, in terms of growth, etc., GDP growth, 5, 6, 7%, something like that. And we, in fact, contracted the year before. Now we are up. Maybe this year the expectations will grow about 3%. But if our neighbors and others are growing at 5, 6%, we are 3%, and our population is very fast growing about the same level. So we have to do something better than them, or at least try to catch up with them.
Fair enough. In terms of these targets and trying to catch up with them, I know that we have to acknowledge we are quite far behind in that regard. Do you think that these policies now, and if we continue on this road, we can catch up?
Well, in terms of targets, it's a mixed picture. For example, in terms of, let's say, revenue. Okay, we had a target of 40% growth. We are not quite there because our FBR targets are maybe up by about, I shouldn't say targets, but FBR collection is actually up about 26% compared to 40%.
Okay.
But this is explainable. Explainable because we collect a lot of taxes on our imports, and our imports were relatively lower because the state bank is still controlling imports, how much is coming in. And also the economic growth was not that high. The other thing is that they are also, tax collection is also related to inflation. If the high inflation, the thing. So all these things are low. So in this scenario, this 26% growth in taxes is reasonable, I should say.
Fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough.
Dr. Usman, as far as these goals are concerned, let's talk about fiscal consolidation to reduce deficits. In this agreement, now that we've received, or we are going to receive the money overall, what areas do you think are going to be targeted to, consolidate, to reduce the deficits that we see at this time?
Well, when we discussed this with the IMF back in 2024, we had a huge area to cover, and we promised them the moon, and they demanded 2 moons. It was just a very combative at the beginning, and finally when we came to that agreement, it was still in a dire national and global economic situation. As time has passed, the scope of what is going to be included in the fiscal consolidation effort has been adjusted. The fiscal consolidation itself is a cutting of expenditure, and at the same time we're talking about increasing revenues, and there's a talk about right sizing, and this right sizing is supposed to be not just at the federal level but also at the provincial level. There are many targets or many areas where that cutting can happen. One argument is that if you have things that are provincial subjects, then why do you have a federal equivalent? Why don't you just cut that off? Similarly, the idea is that if you look at what is happening in the United States with DOGE and they're just gutting things, you don't have to go that far to realize that there are lopsided public value contributions from different parts of government. And so our finance minister, in various different situations, various different audiences, highlights very different things. And with each measure, I feel that there is some amount of resistance that comes. There's vested stakeholders, there are people who are not so keen on having their cut or their slice of the pie being removed. And so I think it's quite a dynamic process. But what has happened in this most recent immediate discussion, which is subject to the approval of the IMF board, is that you will have a big amount that you will have to cut, because on the revenue side you fell short of your target by about 400 billion rupees or so, or 600 billion rupees. It's a pretty large amount percentage wise. So you've got to then look at the expenditure side, and I think whatever happens, it won't be exactly as what was agreed in 2024. That's what we can say.
Dr. Manzoor, so taking things from there, you think that it's going to be largely, of course, we're looking at the huge amount of burden come to the public sector, right? Do you think the private sector is going to be able to bear some burden also, or do you think that most of it is going to be relegated to, of course, our government departments being cut down, overall spending being curtailed?
Well, I think the government's footprint or imprint is very large.
Okay.
The government must reduce it. Well, whatever it is, whether state operated enterprises, this public sector development program, all this, they have to reduce it so that the private sector can come up more.
Okay.
For the time being, it's too much limited to government. But obviously, the private sector has a big role. The government has to remove impediments in their way. I mean, there is all sorts of impediments.
Like, for example? Let's talk about what kind of impediments. Give me an example.
Yes, I can explain a few.
Yes.
We have one of the highest taxation in the region, or globally, I could say.
Yeah.
If you look at our sales tax, at our income tax, at our customs duties, we have the highest. So this is a big. And the other thing is, you see, all these countries which are growing is growing through trade. Whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Bangladesh, any country, our trade has been stagnant, and we have to look at that side so that our trade goes up, instead of putting so much emphasis on taxation, which further dries up the economy. Let some other thing, we should, but they were being pressed.
Do you think that there are alternatives to taxation?
Yes. I mean, for that time, first let the economy grow, and for example, if you lower the tax on, there are various studies, they show that if you don't put this tax so high, your grey economy will reduce size, it will reduce size, so your trade will be much greater, and even income tax, etc., there'll be more people declaring their wealth. If the tax is so high, then everything goes in the wrong direction.
But isn't it true, and Dr. Usman, that like Dr. Manzoor is saying, when you increase tax also, the burden of that tax is relegated to a certain class. I mean, there's a lot of argument about how salaried class at this time is bearing the brunt of it. So why don't we divide it more evenly?
Yes, the principles of taxation are complex in this regard, but you're absolutely right to start off the conversation that the salaried class has been singly targeted in a very unfair manner. That impacts you, Dr. Saab, myself. So the salaried class has been burdened too much. But when you look at the types of taxes we pay, there are the direct and the indirect ones.
Yeah.
So the direct ones are where the punitive measure is most visible, but the indirect taxation, which is the sales tax, is disproportionately punitive towards the poor, because it's a larger percentage of their income that goes into that. That 17% paid on something is a bigger part of their income than it is of yours.
Okay.
So redistribution within a system, the best way to do it is either proportional taxation, that as your incomes are higher, they should be higher, or it is progressive, so that it is a lot more on the very richest. But there are issues with that. For example, how many more businesses are you going to kill by overtaxing the most productive owners of capital, that kind of thing. So there isn't clear answers on it, but I think morally we can all agree that singling out one social class in society is wrong, and disproportionately attacking the poor with punitive measures is also wrong. I think we can agree on that.
But do you think why have we gone towards that? Is it because of course, there are so many issues with tax collection also. So is it because of that the government has, it seems to be the only way to get some kind of tax?
Well, that's exactly right. So tax collection is much easier when you do it at a point of sale that is difficult to avoid. So that's why sales tax is easy when you do it at the petrol pumps.
Yeah.
They're just simply easy on collection, and you will see a lot of tax dodging happening, non-declaration of incomes, I'm a filer or non-filer type stuff on the income side, property tax side, all of these other categories. You have many ways of dodging or simply not declaring, but it's very difficult to somehow avoid a petrol pump and still have your gas filled, that kind of thing.
That kind of thing. But overall, in terms of, let's talk about structural reforms. That's also something that is again emphasized in this agreement, Dr. Manzoor. Do you think that we've made some headway with regard to, of course, the Facilitation Council also, there seems to be across the board all stakeholders agree, and I think that it's in a lot of ways unprecedented, the way that the kind of agreement that we have at this point for going towards and taking all those difficult measures. There is political will that we keep talking about. Do you think that we've made some headway?
Yes, it's a mixed picture.
Okay.
Some structural reforms, I think they're making good progress, like in the energy sector, and even the IMF accepted it, because they were able to bring the sale price of, say, petrol or sale price of electricity, etc., more near the market rate.
Okay.
So it was not an easy decision, but they took it. But there are some other things which government has not really been able to do much. One is about this, their vested interest. If they have a certain, say some of our industry class, they're very highly protected. And they like to, because they're so highly protected, so they just sell within the domestic market. They don't go for exports, because within domestic market, with their high protection, maybe their margin, profit margin is 40–50%. If they take it to export, maybe the profit margin is 5%. So they don't export. So our exports is stuck. There, the government has to make some change, and then there are certain sectors in the taxation which escape the net. We say this salary class has to pay and others, but we have been trying to get these retailers, wholesalers in this thing, service sectors like doctors, engineers, etc. They constitute 60% of the GDP, but they hardly contribute in taxes. So the government has to find some ways. I mean, it's mostly through technology they can do it. They can have all the data and they can make it. So those people, those sectors which are escaping the tax debt, they should try to bring them in rather than just increasing the tax burden on the salary circle or on imports which completely stifle our exports.
For example, you know, there's been a lot of criticism on real estate, agriculture also, and we've spoken about agriculture. It's something that, you know, continues. I think, let's be honest, we've been speaking about agriculture tax for years. Do you think we're closer today, Dr. Usman, or no? Do you think that we are where we were?
I think we're closer than we've ever been. Okay. That's because the political will has increased. It's not very large yet, but it has increased under the subjugation of the IMF's program. And so we've said enough is enough. Plus, agriculture is not as significant a part of our economy as it once was. But the desire to have land reforms was way back in the late 40s. You saw the movement for that. And of course, because the Unionist Party was so strong and they didn't want to be a part of this in any way. There have been movements. There's very interesting research going back to the early 90s of how they declared this against Sharia to do land reform. You know, so how you co-opt the Sharia with the, you know, that kind of stuff. The power of landlords was enormous. It is receding, and that's partly because there's mass urbanization. So people just don't live in the countryside where they can be abused by the feudal serfdom. And the other reason is that it just doesn't contribute as much to the economy because we did industrialize once upon a time, and we're a big service economy now. So
but do you think that agriculture has now been overtaken by things like real estate?
Yes, it has in terms of the value in GDP. You know, so service sector is considerably larger now than the agriculture sector in terms of contribution, because even our agriculture sector is not particularly mechanized, so it doesn't actually work at its maximum yield. So we don't actually export as much as we could or grow as much as we could. But in terms of labor, yeah, there is a lot of the teeming masses still toiling on the fields type phenomena. So in terms of labor, agriculture is significant, but in terms of value in the economy, it's not. So at least things are changing. Like modernity is an overwhelming pressure against feudalism now, I believe, and that creates room for this.
But there's also a lot of criticism against real estate.
Yes.
And that, you know, there is there's little to no tax on that. But what about indirect taxation with regard to that as far as real estate is concerned?
Indirect taxation has some component in that. So for example, when transactions happen or that kind of stuff, there is a percentage charge. There's a lot of dodging on that, for sure. There's a lot of dodging on that. But I think Dr. Manzoor made a very important point about how we view all the services. There is also a strong antipathy of the public towards this sector, I believe, because of how wealthy some tycoons are in it. And there's not the same antipathy towards, for example, doctors because they save lives. Saving lives is a very good thing, but you also got to pay your taxes. So there's many parts to the service sector that collectively dodge.
Which in a sense has replaced, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, that antipathy which once was associated with landowners to perhaps, you know, those tycoons or you know, landowner, you know, like for example, those that we've seen the real estate section, So overall, in terms of that, you know, when we talk about economies that are, for example, you know, serving people more in terms of Pakistan has its own limitations, and I'm going to try and phrase this in the way that I know, Dr. Manzoor, but there is a lot of, you know, there's a lot of resentment also to paying taxes. And whether we talk about indirect taxes, whether we talk about direct taxes, whether we talk about any form of tax, don't you think that, you know, there's a bigger issue unless we deal with that resentment somehow? We won't be able to get the maximum out of, you know, we keep talking about tax to GDP ratio, but let's quell that resentment first.
Yes, I mean, there is, we need to bring in more transparency as to how the money is being spent. And that's what it is, that if you lower the government imprints, as for example, why put 1,000 billion in PIA, keep putting it, and steel mill is closed for 10 years and you still keep paying it. I think that kind of creates hatred. But then on the other hand, you know, there some people are paying, like salary circle.
But they're paying because they have to.
They have to. But you know, our say, okay, doctors may be saving lives, but the lawyers, the kind of fee they charge And you know, there are these various sectors that there is no system, there's no check. There's no check because they're so powerful. At one time, like the feudals used to be in all the assembly and they would block anything. Now maybe thanks to IMF or something. And there was another problem with this, with not having agriculture tax. It's not that the tax on agriculture, but many people put this, their money, they earn elsewhere, put it there, money laundering. They say it comes from there. So they don't have to pay taxes. So they have to find some way. So that's why they have to bring agriculture, etc. And fortunately, the progress that you asked, Dr. Chohan, the progress is that the provinces, for the first time, maybe it's very small,
they're
but
going
at
to
least
be.
They're getting there.
They're getting there. So provinces are paying their tax, and you know,
very little, but at least they've passed a law.
Okay.
And they started moving in that direction. Previously, till this year, they just refused. Now at least they've passed that law. But the thing is, you see, I mean, to increase our productivity, like, and take any example, Vietnam or China, and what they did was that, you know, these farmers who constitute something like 40% of our working, and they produce whatever, but the same production or even more can be made 5% of our population.
Yes.
And they can move to industry, and that will really move the productivity. Industry, services, or elsewhere, and farming could be made more mechanized, etc. So that is the direction it should take.
And in terms of reducing inflation, you know, we're saying that the policies that are aimed at reducing, controlling inflation, how are we doing in that regard?
Well,
and what policies do you think are immediately going to have an effect on, you know, perhaps clamping down on inflation?
Yes, I mean, one, we were helped by international, what should I say, developments. You see, 30% of our imports consist of petroleum and petroleum products. And the price of oil has been down for, you know, for the last 18 months or so.
Yeah.
It's $60, $70. It was more than $100. So that's a big saving. And commodity prices after that war, Ukraine, Russia had really jumped up, and at the time we were importing, so that went on. So these are some of the international factors, but domestically, I think there was a curb on printing how much money. If there's too much money, there's too much inflation, and IMF is watching everything, and so all these things, I think they had to be a little more transparent about how they were doing, and I think that also brought down inflation.
But is it on a downward trend, Dr. Usman? Are we, and again, you know, I keep on saying this, that, you know, we're not just talking about statistics, we're also talking about whether it's actually being felt by all sections of society.
You're very right to ask this question now. You're very right to have asked this in the past, because your concern is for the well-being of the common man. And in that regard, it is peculiar that inflation statistics are at record lows. Every month the number looks better and better. It literally went from like 20% to 10 to 8 to 6 to 4 to 2 to 1.5 now over the last 7 months. It's better. But at the same time, sugar is one commodity that has increased 22% in price over the last 2 months. So then we have to look at how things are measured, because inflation is always imprecise, at least in conventional ways of measuring it, because it depends on the weights you ascribe to things in the basket you're analyzing. And in this basket, if there's something missing but people pay a lot for it, it won't be reflected. So we have to think about how inflation can be at record lows, and yet some key commodity, which unfortunately we have the worst diabetes situation in the world, you know, this sugar, has increased by 22% in 2 months. How can that be happening at the same time? Either nobody is using sugar anymore, or we don't count sugar. So we have to think about how measurements are happening, and that's where we break it down into inflation, which is a rate of change in the composite prices, which is slowing down, not on a downward trajectory, because that's a very specific terminology where it would be disinflation. We're not there yet, but at the same time, there's cost of living, which is a separate metric, and that is actually a relationship between how much you earn versus how much you need to spend.
But don't you think the cost of living has consistently gone up, or you think there's been a reduction there?
No, I do think that it has been at a very high level. Trends are not measured in that regard. We don't have a clear metric for that, but there's always anecdotal evidence that you get that people's wages have not increased at the same level as the cost of many of the key commodities have. So you see the spread between that increasing, and therefore you infer that people are struggling more.
Okay.
And that's a fair statement to make, that people are struggling more. Yes.
So when does it get better then, Dr. Manzoor, the inflation, for those that are struggling more?
Yes, I mean, you see, the one figure that government doesn't really talk about and newspapers don't talk about. For example, the World Bank came out with this figure for 2024. They said Pakistan's poverty rate went up by 7%. So they are 40%. That's very, very high compared to any other country. So we have to look at how to reduce poverty, how our neighbors were able to do it. And unfortunately, we are not there yet, and we're not thinking in those terms. But now that we have some stability, we have to think about reducing poverty, and poverty will only be reduced if your economy is growing more than your population, so that there are more jobs, people have more jobs, and something like that. And as I said, my background is in trade, international trade, and we have to take some measures to see that our trade grows. And Pakistan is not an isolated, and the current policy, as I was is saying, that for the time being it is that we import, make something, and we make it so profitable for industry that they rather consume it here than export it out. So our import bill keeps going up, our export is not growing. So that's a big problem, and government they are now thinking, they are now in the process of finalizing a 5-year next tariff policy for the next 5 years, 25 to 30. And I think they must look at this, what's wrong with it. And there are studies from World Bank and others, they show what's wrong with it, and they tell us how you can overcome it. For example, it will become technical, but they say Pakistan and Egypt have the most cascaded tariff. Means that imports of components, etc., is at a much lower duty, and the final product is a much higher level. So that means the industry has no interest in export, and we should make it more profitable for our manufacturers to export rather than sell in the domestic market. That's the only way, and that it's too much vested interest, but they have to challenge them.
What about Dr. Usman, what about the rupee and dollar interest exchange rate? Now that it's stable, can we talk about a further downward trend, or you think that that's unlikely? Because like I said, the projections of where it would go were extremely pessimistic.
Yes.
Do you think that we've been able to? Of course, it's stable now, but do you think it can go down further?
It's tricky to say, because going down would imply that it is allowed to go down.
Okay.
You see, we were victims of excessive speculation in the currency markets in 2022. That's why, as you correctly noted, the numbers kept becoming scarier and scarier, and people, including you and me, we all started to make decisions around an anticipation that the rupee might be at a very, very massive number, and it would not be good for us. But in the meantime, what was done by the government, which was very, very good, was to just attack the speculators and protect this currency in a narrow bandwidth to give some semblance of stability. That is a double-edged sword, though, because you won't let the rupee sink any further, but if the markets were better and confidence did return, you also wouldn't allow it to rise to a normal level. And so since things have gotten better, for example, inflation's numbers have come down and so on, there is an indication that perhaps the rupee would rise to a much more decent level. Perhaps it's 200 to the dollar. Many people can argue that the actual rate of PKR to USD would never be more than 150 if it weren't for all this meddling, if it weren't for manipulation or speculation. So we don't get a clear indication from market actors, because the market actors may not be clean, but also that the government gets in the way and keeps it in a tight bandwidth. So it's hard to say what the real value of the rupee would have been and what it might be. But if we start to export, and if we have continued strong remittances, which we do, and we continue to have a trade surplus, surplus, it is possible that the rupee could get, and inflation stays down, it is possible that the rupee would be at a more decent and reasonable level than it was led to sink in 2021-22.
Because we keep talking, we keep hearing projections, and we keep hearing talk about how it used to be where it was at one time. And then of course, you know, it's consistently, even if we look at last year, it climbed to a disproportionately high level, and like you said, now it's stable. But the question is that, do you think that overall, what measures would you take today, for example, something Dr. Manzoor said, you also said, you know, in trying to come at a level where there is more revenue, where there is more, you know, we actually have more on our plate to be able to make these decisions, like you said. So what are those decisions? Do you think the government is in a position to make more decisions today than they were a year ago?
Oh, certainly. The room to make decisions is far greater for them, because when you are backed out into a corner, it's very hard to make open decisions. You're actually trying to protect what you have. But that period is now gone, and I think even with the Trump tariffs and everything happening, we aren't the biggest victims of that. It's
because
actually
we don't have enough exports.
True, that's true, that our volume of trade with the United States isn't so large that they would come specifically for us. They would actually have to nail down at least 35 other countries before thinking of us. So that is actually a blessing in disguise. But the fact is that what Dr. Manzoor says fundamentally is the most important thing is to boost your exports. That what that means is your manufacturers should be incentivized to produce a surplus to meet your local demands and then be dealing with the rest of the world. If you do that, then plus your remittances, which have been consistently, they have been consistent and high, then you have a huge trade surplus, which will tell you that there is a demand for the rupee. The rupee is a commodity that has a supply and demand factor, and what we need to have is greater demand for the rupee in the world, and then it will rise automatically.
Is that a possibility, Dr. Manzoor? Because, you know, I'm sorry, but I don't have an economic background, but to me it sounds very far-fetched at the moment.
Well, you know, sometimes things look very far-fetched. But, you know, the other neighbors, other peer countries have done it. Why can't we do it? One big area where we in the past kind of ignored it, we kept talking about it, but we didn't go for this, is information technology, software exports, etc. India went up to something that has gone up to 200 billion. And we were stuck even below a billion. So in the last 2-3 years, now there is a lot of emphasis on exports, etc. And I think we have crossed 3 billion, 3.5 billion. So if the government was to focus more, unfortunately in this budget, last budget, they increased their income tax rates, etc. But maybe they could have let this sector grow a little bit more before they clamped on this. But you know, there are these hidden areas where is a big scope. For example, if they, instead of 3 billion, there's nothing stopping them going to 20 billion. So that will considerably reduce your shortfall of foreign exchange. So once you have enough foreign exchange, then you can do other things. Our problem for the time being, we cannot allow any imports because of shortfall of this thing. Unless imports come, there's no industrial activity, and without imports, there's no export. So all these things are linked. So you have to find some areas, these knowledge-intensive things like IT, like pharmaceutical, etc.
But it said that we're doing far better in IT than we were a while ago. So things are moving.
Moving now, yes, but there's a lot to catch up. For example, even Philippines say their exports are all outsourcing at 30 billion. We are not even 3.5 billion or something. So we are far off. We are trying, but we have to move at a much faster rate.
How long do you think, Dr. Usman, you know, just as a rough idea, if we continue on this road, can it take for us? And which country do you think most, I mean, if we look at, there's so many examples, we do of course have to acknowledge that, you know, India is doing a great job, just, you know, but there are other countries also. With regard to our relationship with China, you know, we have, and they've helped us so much in the past also. Do you think that there are areas we can work on that can really be helpful?
Absolutely, and I think the better way to phrase this would be, are there any countries that we can emulate in our development strategy? And actually, as many Asian countries develop, the number actually grows, that there's actually many countries you can emulate.
Because at one time people would just talk about South Korea.
Yes.
Now there's
plenty others. Malaysia is another. Dr. Saab emphasizes the Vietnamese example a lot. I think it's a very good one because they import 88% of GDP to export 93% of GDP. Like they're just trading so much, they can create so much from that. Bangladesh is another good example. You know, we're not so different and we're not that distant either. And the idea of having an open, outward-oriented economy that gets people to work and that then changes, it challenges the social taboos and obstacles that have kept us in a backward condition, push those aside and move forward as a society. It is certainly possible. And if you ask how long it would take to do that, you will see right now a big transformation happening in our society as we speak.
Okay.
And because of this transition, I actually believe that because of the pyramid of our demographics, people are yearning for that transformation to officially happen, but beneath the surface.
What kind of transformation?
The transformation into a more digital society, a more connected society, a more equitable society, a more open society, all of those values that you would hold as those of a developed country.
You think we're moving towards a more equitable society?
Yeah, of course there is a counter-revolution too. There's a reactionary force too to hold it back. And there's of course the responsibility of the state in that too. But still I feel that the transition is happening beneath the surface of society as young people within their homes are thinking, are seeing how the world works and then looking at the reality around them and unable to square these together. They see that other nations have moved forward, so why can't we? And I think that obvious cross-questioning is leading to a transformation beneath the surface that is in our favor.
Dr. Manzoor, I think that's a very interesting take on where we are at this moment, and I'd like your opinion on this also. Do you agree with what Dr. Usman is saying? You think that beneath the surface there's a lot happening that's perhaps, you know, we can look at much more optimistically?
Yes, yes, but he also pointed out, you know, that there's counter forces as well. So, you know, hopefully.
So you think that that natural kind of fight and you know that's going to, and we're going to have to see what happens and what emerges?
Yes, unfortunately the country is again, there's an upsurge in this terrorism, etc.
Yes.
And the more people see instability, foreign investors, they just hold back. So let's hope that there's more
things remain
peace,
stable, so there's more growth.
Yeah, so that there's more investment coming in the country, and that would considerably ease our problems then.
I know I'm running out of time, but I quickly want to talk about the energy sector reforms also, Dr. Usman. Do you think that those are on the cards? IMF has also said so repeatedly. What kind of energy sector reforms do you envisage?
There's three parts to it, according to the plan that the government has articulated. The first is to get some more savings out of the capacity payments paid to the IPPs. So the way those contracts were negotiated were terrible. That's one thing. At the same time, there's the solarization part of it and adjusting it so that, yes, dependency on the grid goes down. But and the third thing is then keeping that grid stability so that you don't have everybody go into that death spiral we've talked about. These three components together, I think, are what they're pushing for. So there's a renewable component, there's an IPP component, and there's a grid stability component. So they have thought it through, and it cannot happen overnight, and it's a question.
So what kind of a time frame are you looking at?
I'm looking at about 2 to 3 years for it to happen. That's also the expected length of this IMF engagement too. And by the end of that, we should be able to say to ourselves, even more so than to the IMF, that we have ended one thing, this parasite that had been on our back for a long time.
So are we going to be looking at periodic reviews with regard to this, or are they going to come back after a year or two now?
I think that twice a year they will look at it carefully and see, have we done it? Why aren't we doing it? That kind of thing. That accountability is going to be not just because we need it, but because the IMF insists on this sort of review. It may happen more than twice, but at a minimum twice a year, they will look at how we're doing with the changes that we committed to have made.
And we expect more release of more money after a year or so.
I mean, you know, that's already in the plan that, you know, you do this and whenever you get through this review. Our problem in the past used to be that we couldn't get past those reviews because we were not able to implement those conditions. But fortunately, the reviews have become relatively smoother. I mean, this time also they came and they were more or less expected that they'll do it, and within 2 weeks of their returning, they'd done it. Normally it used to take weeks and weeks and months. And there was that instability.
With a lot of statements flying back and forth, which led to more instability.
Our stock market was reacting to that, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So, because there are lots of other things linked to IMF loan. So this has become much smoother than the. And the other thing, I think, energy sector, earlier you asked, and as Dr. Chohan said, but there's another factor that in 2 years, 3 years, we are having many of these hydroelectric dams coming through. For example, I think Suki Kanari is this year, and then there's Dasu and Basha are in 2 years' time, 2028. And there was some problem with Jhelum, that canal which just collapsed. What was that? I don't remember the name, but that's now, it's under construction. So that's happening. Malakand is happening. So in 2-3 years, we get a lot of electricity from water. So that would bring down our costs quite substantially.
So
and also, if we are able to renew a little bit of our transmission, there's too many losses there.
So it could become easier for the consumers also?
Yes, that will considerably bring down, because for the time being we are too much dependent on imported energy, and that's very expensive.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Manzoor Ahmed. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Usman, thank you for being with us today. We spoke about, of course, the economic situation today, and of course what the new IMF deal can mean for the future. But something interesting that we spoke about also is that, perhaps we see now this review is smoother. There is of course overall stability, and there doesn't seem to be that kind of erratic malfunctioning that we see with the stock exchange reacting. So things seem to be stable and smoother, certainly. Also, I think we spoke about the fact that certainly when all of this is happening, perhaps things are moving towards a more rethink in society, a more equitable, I believe was said, word was used, society coming up with its own undercurrents. And perhaps, as a whole, we are moving towards, a greener kind of tomorrow, where there is more to look forward to, where things are more stable. And, if we can quell all kinds of instability, if we can quell the kind of terrorism that unfortunately has, seeped in over time, and we know that there are no stone is being left unturned by the state of Pakistan, by the government of Pakistan, to ensure that things do seem to be headed in the right direction. Thank you so much for joining us today on Perspectives.